This is David Pannell from the University of Western Australia, and this is a talk about real-world impacts from research, evidence and lessons. So the context for this presentation is that there's been a growing perception that we need to do a better job of convincing government about the benefits from research. So for example, in Australia, the Australian Research Council has been discussing whether and how to include real-world impacts in their assessment of research quality. The so-called ERA, the Excellence in Research in Australia scheme, in the first round didn't include real-world impact, but it's likely to in some future phase. In the UK, their equivalent scheme, the Research Excellence Framework, is already set to include real-world impact from 2014, and it will account for 20% of the assessment for each unit that's assessed. In Australia, preempting the Australian Research Council, a group of universities, the so-called Group of 8, and the Australian Technology Network of Universities and a couple of others got together and decided to run a trial to see if and how they could evaluate the real-world impact from various research projects. So each university submitted selected case studies, and they were evaluated by people largely from industry and government. And the 24 so-called best projects were identified and published in the book that you can see, or the report that you can see pictured there. So my plan in this talk, is to start by presenting an example of a research project where a group of us has made serious efforts to have a real-world impact, and this was in fact one of the projects selected for inclusion in that report that I just showed you. Then I'll talk about some evidence that relates to the level of impact and the timing of impact from research, and then I'll make some comments about the measurement of impact from research, and I'll conclude with some comments about strategies for having impact from research. Okay, first this example. So in 2000 in Australia, salinity was a hot topic. There were television series and books and numerous government reports highlighting the serious threat from salinity in Australian rural areas and to Australian waterways and biodiversity and infrastructure and agriculture. And at the time, it so happened that I was already working on salinity as a research topic, and so was quite well informed about the issue and about the research that had already been done. Just about then, in late 2000, the Australian government announced the National Action Plan for Salinity and Water Quality, which is a very large program by Australian Environmental Program Standards, $1.4 billion of public funding. So I carefully read the material about this program and was shocked. My evaluation of this program was very negative. I thought that the design of the program was very poor, that the people who put the program together had been unaware of really crucial areas of salinity research and what their implications were for the design of an effective program. And my view right from the start was that this was a program that really had no chance of any significant enduring benefits because of these errors and because of the ignorance of the science. My response at the time was various. I had various responses. One was to get angry and to get into the media, to put out a bunch of discussion papers, to make presentations to various audiences, to make submissions to government inquiries and so on. But I soon realised that I needed to do more than just point out the flaws in the program. I needed to try and help people recognise how to fix those problems. And so I shifted tack, and with a group of other collaborators, we started to develop tools to help environmental policymakers and decision makers make better decisions. And one of those was the Investment Framework for Environmental Resources. This was designed to be a tool to integrate science and other information to help improve decision making. It helps people to develop logical, evidence-based environmental projects. It's designed to assess the value for money from those projects and to prioritise amongst potential projects. We adopted a strategy of really trying to engage. So the project involved extensive input from users, including users at the grassroots level involved in on-ground environmental management, right through to people involved in policy. From that engagement, we realised that the tools needed to be as simple as possible, so we struck a very difficult balancing act between making the tools simple enough to be usable by the intended users, but also rigorous and sophisticated enough to actually do the job that they were meant to do. We provided, and we still provide, training and a help desk for users of our tools. We developed documentation at a range of levels of detail. We continue to provide critiques of existing approaches where they needed to be criticised, and we attempted to influence the government agencies to change the signals that they were sending to environmental managers at the grassroots level about the sorts of things they should be investing in and what sorts of approaches they should be taking to their decision making about that. We had some degree of success. There are more than 50 regions with environmental management bodies across Australia, and almost half of those have had some sort of a look at INFFER. They've undertaken training, or they've applied it, on a trial basis at one end of the spectrum, right through to the other end where some regions have adopted it very seriously, and it's become part of the core way that they do their business. The process, as I said, is quite participatory. This is a photo from a community workshop. We've conducted about 150, or about 150 have been conducted in sort of response to our sort of advice about how to do it across Australia. And we've also had some impact at the policy level, not as much as we would like, but we can identify a number of areas where our influence has made a tangible difference. So there's a Senate inquiry into salinity recommended the use of our tools. The Ministerial Council, which is sort of a peak policy body in Australia, changed or adopted a set of principles for investing in salinity. One of the state governments, Victoria, adopted INFFER as a tool that they would use at the regional level, and our approach to prioritising projects had some influence on the national program Caring for Our Country in the specific design of the project template and the criteria and the metric used to rank projects. So I want to make a few comments about lessons that were learned from this experience. I'll have some more comments of this type later on, not necessarily from our research, but from our research it was very clear that if you want people to use good science, that the people issues are crucial. The forming of good relationships with potential users and people who influence them, and really good communication is important. One of our challenges was that most prospective users of our information and tools were happy with their current approach, even though in many cases our assessment was that the current approaches were quite poor, or in some cases very poor. We found that people perceived that even if they did improve their approaches to decision making about environmental projects, that it wouldn't help them because government wouldn't recognise their efforts and recognise that their approach was improved, and it wouldn't affect their chances of getting funding from government. So that was a barrier to improving the quality of use of our science. We also found that there were some barriers around user capacity. From some research we did, we found that there was a distinct lack of capacity amongst our potential users to formally integrate disparate technical and socio-economic information to inform decision making. They have to do this, of course they do it, but in a very subjective way, and from our experience often not very well, and they're very uncomfortable and lack skills in doing it in a more rigorous way. They also lack expertise in economics and social science. They have some expertise in science, but their task in many cases is to try and influence human behaviour. So without expertise in economics and social science, they're really seriously hamstrung in knowing how to respond and do that. They're always in a rush. They have a lack of time to read things and to stop and think and contemplate. And we also found that people very easily misinterpret advice or instructions or processes, and so a lot of mistakes are made even when people are trying to do the right thing. That was one of the reasons why we put such an emphasis on training and user support. Okay, so you can see that effort. So as a researcher, that effort has required considerable time, and it's involved me and my team doing things that are beyond traditional research. It's been a big time commitment. We've had to learn new skills and knowledge, and we've had to develop new networks. And so it's a fair question, I think, whether it's a case of research versus real-world impact, or can it be research and real-world impact. There's certainly been benefits in terms of the impact, and it's been very satisfying to see impact occur when it has occurred, but it's been very challenging to make a difference. And so it's fair enough to ask the question, is it worth it? So I tried to identify some of the benefits from a research perspective, not just from an impact perspective, but from a researcher's perspective from this activity. And in my view, there have been a range of benefits from my research. One is that it's helped me to identify interesting and different problems and issues, and focus my research into new areas that have prompted me to be relatively innovative and to work on things that aren't necessarily a current focus of work in the journals. A lot of research in the journals is sort of incremental, building on past research, but from the work that we've done in this area, from engaging with real-world decision makers, it's really forced us to confront some completely different issues and to develop some tools and some research that's quite innovative. It's helped me to develop a better understanding of the relevance of the research that I'm doing, and it's really changed the way I think about the decisions I make about the research that I want to work on. And in a very sort of traditional way of looking at research, it hasn't inhibited our ability to publish in good quality journals. So on a quick count, over the last decade or so, there's been around 17 journal articles published directly on the work in the INFFER project, and about another 16 that are related to that work or stimulated by it. So, we've managed to be quite productive on this project, just in terms of a pure academic criteria, in addition to the more real-world impact criteria. The other benefit from a researcher's point of view is that because of the reputation that we've developed for doing useful research, it's become considerably easier to obtain research funding. And we've even had some cases of unsolicited approaches offering dollars to do research on particular topics, something that probably doesn't happen all that often in the research world. Okay, so that's enough on that particular example. I want to talk now about some broader evidence and examples from the literature on the impact of research. And the first part is evidence about high rates of return from research. There has been quite a bit of research on the benefits of research, and typically estimated rates of return to R&D are very high. It's not difficult to find examples of analyses where people have estimated rates of return of 30, 50, or even 100% annual rates of return. Now, in my view, those rates, particularly the higher end, are not really credible. They often you might find individual cases, but as a common result, it's not really very credible. So to illustrate that, if you invested $1 at a 50% rate of return over 100 years, the payoff would amount to 1 million times Australia's annual GDP. So it's really not realistic. But work that's been done to take those studies, take existing studies and weed out the good and the bad, and look at and correct some of the more optimistic assumptions that have been made, have found that sound analyses still show very good rates of return for both applied research and basic research. Okay, so that's encouraging. However, the distribution of benefits is highly skewed. In cases where people have looked at sort of a portfolio of research within an area, there's a wide range of payoffs. Most research has relatively low impact, but a small number of projects have very, very large impact, more than enough to pay for the rest. So that has some implications for the approach to evaluating research. It perhaps, to me, it suggests that the case study approach may be sufficient. It may not. It may be to get a handle on the overall benefits if you choose the case studies carefully and well. An example of a recent study in Australia looking at returns to research was work by the Allen Consulting Group on the benefits to the Cooperative Research Centre program in Australia. They took a really, in my view, quite a conservative approach to counting benefits, but still managed to identify $7.5 billion of benefits over the study period from a much smaller investment. Their benefit cost ratio estimate was a bit over 3. And I think, realistically it was probably more than that. Okay, another observation from the literature is that the impact from the real-world impact from research is often slow, and sometimes extremely slow. Lags to impact is usually measured in decades, and there's some evidence on this from work on US agriculture, which found that the time lag from first investment through to the peak impact, not the first impact, but the peak impact, was about 24 years, and that agricultural research was still generating measurable benefits after about 50 years. So really this is really long and slow, and it creates big challenges in terms of measurement of impact. There are several reasons for these long time lags. One is that the research takes time to do. It can take time to commercialise research once it's completed. Even after it's commercialised, it can take a long time for people to adopt the research or just change their behaviour if it's not commercial-oriented research. And even after people have changed their behaviour, it may still take a while for the research to have its impact. So all in all, these lags really add up to some quite long time lags. Unfortunately, the longer time lags mean that in economic terms the benefits of research are reduced in present value terms. So economists use a technique called discounting, which is really about allowing for the interest costs on the upfront investment, and over say a 30-year time lag, the interest costs on the upfront investment in the research build up. If the rate at which they build up is 7%, which is sort of a typical recommended rate by government guidelines, then the benefits would be reduced in the present day terms by 87%. But it's important to note that the high measured rates of return are there despite this sort of reduction due to long time lags. Okay, another thing I'll mention briefly from the literature is this the debate around the importance of supply push versus demand pull as determinants of, or drivers of, real-world impact. Back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, thinking about real-world impact from research tended to use what's these days termed the linear model, in which the concept was that basic research would result in information which prompted applied research, which led to technology, which led to real-world benefits. But in the 60s, there was some work that said actually it's actually the market demand or demand from users that is the real prompter rather than basic research. And there was some debate about which of these two schools of thought was right during the 60s, which was resolved in the 70s when some comprehensive studies concluded that in fact innovation is an iterative process, and both supply push and demand pull are important factors in many cases. So it isn't one or the other, both matter. But I think it's important that it's a supply push, which is probably the most common mindset that scientists come to this issue with is often not sufficient, that there is a need to cultivate demand as well. Okay, some comments about measuring impact. I mentioned that there's quite a bit of research on the estimation of impact, and if you sort of summarise it down into a simple checklist of the sorts of factors that determine the level of benefits arising from research, it's these sorts of factors. And this is very simplified, but the scale of relevance for the research, is it something that's only relevant to one city, or is it relevant to a whole country, or even internationally? The adoptability of the research, how easy is it for intended end users to take it up? Is it very complex or risky for them, or does it fit very neatly into their existing systems and processes? If people do take it up, what are the benefits per unit? Is it only slightly better than what they're currently doing, or is it much better than what they're currently doing? What's the probability of research success? Not all research is successful, something that would need to be accounted for when estimating the benefits of prospective research. What share of the credit can be attributed to particular pieces of research, or to research at all? Sometimes changes in behaviour or changes in the benefits that are generated that it might appear to be due to research are due to other factors, such as changes in market conditions. So this sort of attribution factor is important. And then the time lags, which I've already mentioned. An important part of this thinking about the benefits of research is that benefits need to be measured as a comparison or a difference with and without the research. The correct way to do this is not to compare before and after the research, because the real world is dynamic, and what would have happened without the research is likely to involve change. So, for example, in this diagram, without the research, the productivity or utility of a particular industry or maybe an environmental issue is declining. That's the blue line. So without the research, you'd have this drop-off. With the research, you get the red line, and so the real benefit is not the difference between before and after the research, it's with and without the research. It's the vertical distance between the red line and the blue line at a particular point in time. So, as I mentioned, there's quite a bit of analysis that's been done measuring the benefits of research. The theory, the tools to do that are very well developed. There are textbooks and journal articles and so on about this. So the theory is relatively straightforward, but how applicable is it? It has, as I say, been widely adopted, and probably the area where it's been most intensively adopted and used is in agriculture. But is it widely applicable? Well, there's some challenges, particularly if we're thinking of using it as a sort of a routine tool to measure impact of research rather than doing it in sort of special case study cases. One is that it takes resources and skills, and most researchers don't have the skills or knowledge to apply these tools, and they probably don't want to spend the time to do it. And estimating benefits using the standard economic tools that are available is easier in some cases than others. It's probably, in my view, it's easier for research that results in physical products than for research that produces knowledge. It's easier if the benefits arise in markets than if they are sort of maybe social or environmental benefits that don't arise in markets. It's easier if the benefits occur quickly, and it's easier for applied research rather than basic research. So, I mentioned the context for this talk is around a renewed concern that we need to be able to demonstrate real-world impact from research, and universities are starting to pay quite a bit of attention to this. But from a university perspective, there's some real challenges here, because much university research is not in the categories that are relatively easy to evaluate. Much university research generates knowledge rather than physical products. It's in the area of public goods rather than in the market. It can be quite slow to deliver benefits, and a lot of university research is much more at the basic end of the spectrum than the applied end. So what could happen? What would the ERA do? What would the Australian Research Council do if it wanted to include real-world impact in their assessment of research? Well, I don't know what they'll do at this time, but one possibility is that they may copy the UK's Research Excellence Framework, and if they were to do that, then the approach would involve two components. One is case studies in a similar way to the Australian trial that I've mentioned a couple of times, and the other component in the UK system is a description by the units who are submitting their information that describes their efforts, described as their approach to enabling impact from research. What activities have they done? What processes do they use to try and get their research out there and being used? And I'm pretty confident that they won't be expecting an economic evaluation, although of course if you've done one that would be pretty helpful. If it is case studies that we as researchers have to provide, then what would we need to do? Well, we need to make the case and tell a story about how our research has created impact, and a significant part of that will be, and I think, describing and linking the elements in the chain from research through to impact, showing that you understand the different phases that your research has sort of gone through to get to the point of delivering real-world impact. And the other component is about providing evidence. Now, one of the interesting things that came out of the recent Australian trial was that many researchers were very poor in their ability to describe and understand impact and to put forward convincing evidence. In their descriptions, the chain was incomplete and poorly described, and much of the evidence that was provided was weak and unconvincing. And this is even though these projects were cherry-picked to, somebody perceived that they were projects that had high impact. So one implication of that is that if you're a researcher and you're able to do this well, then you'll stand out. So there could well be some benefits to people who can develop the skills to do this. Okay, my last set of comments is around having an impact. If you're a researcher that desires to have an impact, how could you do it? And unlike the previous section, where there has been quite a bit of research measuring the level of impact, there's actually very little research describing how to have an impact on the effectiveness of different approaches to attempting to have an impact. There are a number of papers published in journals, but they're largely anecdotal. They're not really, the information in them is sort of observation of experience rather than strongly evidence-based research about what was effective. At the end of the PowerPoint, I'll list a few resources that can help provide some advice about how to have an impact. But here's some ideas. One is, as I've already mentioned, the importance of being able to describe the chain from research to impact. The chain varies greatly from case to case, and the chain can have very many links. It can be a very straightforward chain in some cases, but the end users might be directly linked to researchers, and then that's your chain and you're finished. But sometimes there are multiple links in the chain. And understanding the chain for your research can help you to choose, design and deliver research for greater impact. It can help you to communicate that impact, and it can help you to provide evidence. So here's an example of a chain from research to impact. This is for research that aims to develop new technology. So the chain might consist of a series of links like this. The research and development is undertaken. Then there's a process of selling the IP to potential commercial entities. They then, or maybe even before that, conduct feasibility studies. If feasibility looks likely, they might go into an engineering and design sort of phase. If that's successful, there's a process of gearing up for manufacturing. Then maybe at the same time, or maybe after that, they need to seek finance. There's a marketing phase, and then finally you get to sales and real-world impact. Of course, it varies a fair bit from case to case, but that's sort of one example of how it might look. Here's a completely different example. This is much closer to my own area of work, undertaking research to provide information to influence policy. So the research is undertaken. Something useful is learned, or maybe it isn't in some cases. That new information may or may not influence policy. Even if you are successful in influencing policy, that policy may or may not get implemented. A lot of policy is not implemented. If that policy is implemented, it may or may not influence people's behaviour. And even if it does influence people's behaviour, it still may or may not actually generate real-world benefits. So, again, even in this different type of research to impact world, there are many different steps, and there is the possibility of failure, unfortunately, at all these different steps. So going from research to impact can be quite a challenging task, even if one wishes to pursue it. So some observations from my own experience in the environmental policy, environmental economics world. For us, we've faced the risk of low benefits from research to influence policy for a variety of reasons. One could be that nobody's listening. We've certainly experienced that. One, depending on who the audience is, we may lack credibility with the decision maker, or the decision maker may trust us or think that we have the right skills, but not be able to understand and utilise our advice. So those first three are sort of about communication and the people side. The next three are a bit different. The new results, there may be new results, but they may not be different enough from the old results, from our existing knowledge, for it to be worth changing behaviour or management. It may be that we've got interesting new research findings, but research isn't the only factor that's important in determining what policy should be. There's also economic and social and political factors, say, and so the decision may not be altered, so research doesn't generate its potential benefits. And then you may actually influence behaviour or management or policy and create a change, but the benefits of that change might not be that great. It might be that the new situation is only very slightly better than the old. Okay, a few comments on some of the lessons from our experience, but also from the literature about having an impact. I've already mentioned that an important element here is to have some demand pull, not just to rely on supply push. And that's about cultivating and communicating well with potential users. And there's an aspect of that is that it's important to understand and respect potential users. In our experience, it's been important to be prepared for opposition. It doesn't always go smoothly. And so you need some perseverance and some resilience in the face of opposition, and a continued effort to market your output, and a willingness to be repetitive. Particularly in the policy sphere, the government often has a very short memory. And so, in certain government areas, I think in Australia, especially at the national level, there's an incredibly high level of turnover of staff in particular positions. I think it's a really seriously problematic aspect of Australian government. Causes all sorts of problems. And so it means if you're engaging with them as a researcher, you're going to need to be willing to be repetitive. And it can be very beneficial and helpful if you can identify an internal product champion in the organisations that you're trying to influence. That can be difficult, of course. It can be very beneficial. Well, you really need to consider whether the organisations that you're trying to influence have what's called absorptive capacity. Do they have the systems and the people and the knowledge to take up your research? It can be worth recognising that the political circumstances may need to be right. That's not necessarily a requirement, but for certain types of research results it could be. Your result may only be compatible with the ideological position of one side of politics. So it's not a lot of point in trying to influence government when the other side's in power. That's partly about timing, but timing is also about other aspects, not just about politics, but about just the timing of the policy cycle. Policies have a life, and when they're getting towards the end, that's the time when people are discussing what should happen next. That's probably the time when you have the most chance to make a difference. I've already referred earlier to good communication, and that means, amongst other things, that the communication has to be simple and clear and brief, avoid jargon, avoid maths, avoid complex graphs. all of those things, things that many researchers are very, very poor at and really have to work at and develop skills in. And then the last point here is it's worth thinking about impact when choosing what research to do. So I'm not saying that you should only choose to do research that has high impact, but in my view, it's worth thinking about having some of the research in your portfolio being research that has a high probability of generating impact. So in conclusion, I think that in Australia particularly, but also around the world, we researchers are increasingly going to be asked to demonstrate real-world impact. And doing that is not just about communicating what we already do. I think that in many cases we're going to need to change what we do in order to have genuine impact. And that's going to require changes in signals and changes in management at the university level and in research institutions. My personal experience and view is that pursuing impact is exciting for its own sake and very worthwhile, but can be very challenging. But it's not all downside, it's not all challenges, because it can have really substantial spin-off benefits from a more academic research perspective as well. And finally, my observation is that the earlier in the research process you start to think about impact, the more likely you are to have some. Thanks very much. I said that I would show some resources. You don't need to write these down because you can download this PowerPoint from my website, which I'll show you at the end. But in this list of resources, I've got some journal articles, a couple of which I wrote, one of which I didn't, and also some blog posts, a couple from my blog, one that's not from my blog, and down the bottom there a video which I found very interesting. And that's the website where you can download this PowerPoint and get more details of those resources.